without any further ado, let's get right into it because I have a lot of ground to cover tonight. We're supposed to talk about the conflict between the Jews and the British. Let's see if I have my Jake's laser pointer here. Between the Jews and the British in these years that we're talking about. I emphasize the Jews and the British. I'm not talking about the Jews and the Arabs. That's interesting in of itself. In order for Israel to get off the ground, first they had to deal with the British, and then they had to deal with the Arabs. And those are two separate stories. So let's take it from the beginning over here, if we can. Let's go for the first one, right there, yeah. Basically, those are here in the past, at my talks will recall that the Jews and the British are basically a shidduch that went sour because in the beginning there was a real honeymoon. The Balfour Declaration, for example, the British government on its own. And in international law, in the Treaty of San Remo in 1920, assigned this for a future Jewish state. You understand that. This is equal to Israel and Jordan, as you know. That was all supposed to be our land, which is assigned by the world to the British to hold in trust as a mandate, to hold in trust to implement the Balfour Declaration, which means it was supposed to be some kind of Jewish state, provided the interests of the people who are not Jewish would not be negatively impacted. So in other words, it wasn't with the idea of taking away anybody's land, actual confiscation of land or anything like this. But look how big that is, There's plenty of room for all the Jews in the world in that. All right? Didn't happen. And because this was a shidduch that was based on a heart over mind, on a philo-Semitism. I didn't say anti-Semitism, I said philo-Semitism versus imperial interests. That's a tricky business, right? The Balfour Declaration was not in the political interest typically regarded by, typically defined, and yet the British did it anyway. It's very interesting. But over the course of time, the inherent contradictions between the heart and mind, between what was in the physical, political favor of the British and what was perhaps in their moral one, clashed. And so the relationship, as can happen sometimes with a bad shidduch, was structurally unsound. This structural unsoundness had fatal consequences for the Jewish people during the Holocaust, as I tried to explain last year. 1 million Jews and maybe 2 million were blocked by the British. Some of you were here when we talked about this last year. Were blocked by the British during the years of the war, 40 to 45, because, by the British, I repeat, and the State Department went along with them, because they're afraid if these people get out, they'll want to go to Palestine, and that'll upset the apple cart in the Middle East and hurt the British imperial interests over there and tick off the Arabs. And so it's pretty scary. If not for that, the British wouldn't have minded if, for example, the Kestner case, if 500,000 Hungarian Jews would have probably been traded for trucks or something like this. It boggles the mind that a lot of Jewish lives, a lot, could have been saved, but they were afraid of the Zionist angle. They're afraid of the Middle East angle. And so these people who were our friends became actually the worst enemies. I don't know if people understand this usually so well. Those who follow closely what we talked about last year, hopefully, will understand this. The British, by blocking the escape route for a lot of Jews, were complicit in the Shoah, and they did it because of their national interest. That's what countries do. This is the problem with being homeless. It's helpless. It's the problem when some of us know these kind of tragic situations. A parent, for example, will, perhaps give all their money to the kids and say, you take care of it for me. That's not a smart idea, is it? Because then the kids are running the money on their interests, what works for them more than what works for the person in whose trust you're supposed to be holding it. I know this doesn't happen in Baltimore, but I've heard it happens in other places. Okay, so it's a structurally funny kind of relationship situation. Both sides, the Jews and the British, had peculiar profiles in our period in 1945, peculiar combinations of strength and weakness, which makes the struggle between them so very interesting. On the one hand, you have the peculiar situation of the British at the end of the Second World War in 1945. They were the Pyrrhic victors of World War II. Right? The British Empire did survive, was intact. Let's go to the next one. Look how big, that's the British Empire around the world. Okay? So it's not everything, but it's for a little country, it's a lot. Would you agree? And not only that, if you really pay very close attention, for example, the Straits of Gibraltar, the Suez Canal, a place like that, they made it, it's Hong Kong, they made it their business to be at strategic points, crossing trade routes and things like that, waterways around the world. So they really had their hands on the vitals of a lot of the world's transportation. It was a very interesting kind of phenomenon. They survived the Second World War. By 1945, all this is in British hands. The empire over here was very useful, I would say. As a matter of fact, they couldn't have won without it. One of the reasons they beat Hitler to the degree that they did, one of the reasons they beat Hitler is because the British had empire. They had access to all the resources of the world, and more importantly, they kept the Germans away from it. Think about what it mean in terms of Rommel and North Africa. The British had Malta, they had Cyprus, they had Gibraltar, already from before as part of the empire, and therefore they had these bases that could block the Germans, and the same thing with the Japanese. And so, I repeat, the fact that they kept Hitler away from these natural resources is one major reason, not the only one major reason he lost the war. The reason he had to attack Russia, for example, was to get the raw materials and the goods that he was denied because of the British Navy and places like that. So it was very important. The British did not lose a lot of men in Second World War. I think altogether they lost 300,000, 400,000 men, which is tiny considering we're talking about World War II. They lost that in a month, typically, in World War I. Right? The Somme, Passchendaele, these places, they lost a wealth of people. In the First World War, in the Second World War, they played it very careful. Stalin kept saying, let's have a second front. Churchill kept saying, if you know the story, no, no, no. Okay? And so they came out, as I say before, I won't say unscathed, but you understand what I mean when I say relatively unscathed. And but they had very heavy economic losses. They lost they spent 25% of their total national wealth on fighting World War II. That's a lot if you understand that. The British, to fight the war, had to build up the Royal Navy. The Royal Air Force was gigantic, much larger than Germany's. They had to fight a war in the Atlantic, and many people don't realize that the British had a major war in the Pacific too. General Slim fighting in Impal and places like that, in India and Burma against the Japanese, cost a lot of money. That's tremendously expensive. And they went through the Blitz, so their whole country was bombed out. Their housing and their industrial plant, they took a lot. Already before America got into the war, they were already broke, and they were getting free from America. It's called Lend-Lease. Churchill knows, before Pearl Harbor, had to write to Roosevelt, it's very famous, and he said, listen, we're broke, and you got to do something because we just cannot go on. We have the men, we have the will, we don't have the money. And Roosevelt came up with this idea, Lend-Lease is a bunch of baloney, it's giving away, but it was a nice term to bamboozle everybody. But the fact of the matter is that they were broke. They won the war, but they spent themselves into the poorhouse. Now, this is not at all unusual. The United States may be getting in this situation. How much did the Iraq war cost us? Right? Wars cost a lot of money anymore nowadays, besides the other side of it. Besides the human cost and all the rest of it. It just costs a heck of a lot. It's beyond the capacity of many people, many countries to play with. So when the war was over, the British were victorious, but they're pyrrhic winners because they had no food, they didn't grow a lot, and then it cost a lot of money to bring it in. And they had no housing because the Germans bombed everything and it cost a lot of money to build the houses. And yet at the very same time, the sentiment in England was building up that they wanted the total modern welfare state, which costs a lot of money. Okay? This is a sentiment that had been building up in England for a long time. In America, you have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. In England, you have the Conservative Party and the Labour Party. But the Labour Party is to the left of the Democrats. It is a socialist party. And in those days, far more socialist than it is today. And so they really wanted a socialist system. I didn't say communism. They didn't want a dictatorship or anything like that. But they really wanted a situation where you have free health, free housing, free this and free that. And as we all know, it says in the Gemara, Kesef Manola, where do you get the money for all this sort of thing? And listen, this is an existential problem of the 21st century, that the modern welfare state costs too much money. And this is why the European countries, for example, maybe America, have allowed in Well, let's take Europe, for example. They allowed in 1.5 zillion of these Muslim immigrants simply because they need people to work and produce in order to pay the Social Security checks for the people that are already there and are older and, and the welfare benefits and things like this. But when you bring in a whole bunch of foreigners, they stay, and then you have unintended and unexpected social and cultural consequences as well. So this kind of business starts in England during the Second World War. They had what they call the Beveridge Report, where a civil servant produced a plan for the England of tomorrow, and it'll be a perfect place with a full socialist welfare. So everything will be free, and the public really went in on it. They said, we're fighting now such a hard war and all the rest of it, but when it's over, we'll get, as I say before, this a welfare state. Nobody asked the question, naturally, they never do, who's going to pay for all of this? And as a result, the minute the war was over, they had this very important election, and the Conservative Party, which had been in power for 10 years, England skipped an election. I don't know if you know this. According to the English system, although they don't have a constitution, every 5 years at least, you're supposed to have an election, basically. It's not written in stone, but it's written in minhag. Within every 5, you can have less also, but 2 years, 3 years. But within every 5 years, you're supposed to have an election. And the Conservative Party won a huge landslide in 1935 for a variety of reasons. And they didn't have to have another election in 1940 because the war was on. And what happened was the Labour Party said, we like Churchill. It's a very interesting story. We don't agree with him. He's crazy on domestic policies and a lot of other things like this, but he understands Hitler. They are the ones that put Churchill in power. It wasn't the Conservative Party. Now, he was a conservative, and he was a reactionary Tory, and he was a super capitalist, and was very against socialism and all that kind of stuff. But they said, the Labour Party leaders, they said, he understands Hitler, and therefore we will back him. That's why Chamberlain fell from power, because the Labour Party said we won't back Chamberlain. And you had to have a national unity in order to fight Hitler. And so it's a very interesting story, a little bit like Reagan. There were a lot of people that voted for Reagan. They said, I guess he's crazy on the economics and all this other stuff, or that he believes the trees cause pollution. But he understands the Russians. I remember this. You remember this too, many of you, right? He said, the communists, that he really understands in ways that Jimmy Carter and these other guys don't. So that was Churchill's power. But the minute the war was over, out. And so they had an election, and they wiped out the Tory party, and they took over. So you had one of the biggest landslides in British history, and the Labour Party came into total power with a program to implement, as they say, a welfare state, and they're broke. It's wrong time. And how's it going to work? And as the result was, many people were around the world were surprised. Here was, of course, Churchill, and here's the guys that knocked him out, Clement Attlee and Bevan. Lord Balfour, of course, you remember, was the other side of the shidduch when times were good and music was still playing. he was far gone by the time we're speaking about. But Churchill was world known, as you know. This guy, most people hadn't heard of. These two people, they played a very important role in World War II in supporting Churchill and all that. But it was a pretty shock for people. If you see the pictures, which I'm not going to show you, the Potsdam Conference, when it first starts, you have Truman. That already is a shock. Instead of Roosevelt, Truman, Stalin, and then Churchill. And all of a sudden, it's Truman, Stalin, and Attlee, and everybody says, who's that guy, And it symbolizes the radical change that took place in England. And Churchill, of course, was just famous actor. And Attlee was a cold fish. This is well known. And he nevertheless said, we are going to implement the welfare state, and they do. So that this put England in a big problem in the years of the fight for Israel, because that's why I'm going through all this. This is 45, 46, 47, 48, and 49, exactly when you have the struggle for Israel. England is not the old England. They're in a funny and peculiar situation. The government nationalized the steel industry, the coal industry, and all this kind of stuff. They imposed confiscatory taxes of 90%. This is really true, of 90% or whatever on the millionaires. They really did the old-fashioned socialist, not communist, but socialist program, national, socialized medicine, totally. Similar things all across the board, free housing, you name it. And they really were passionate about implementing all this, but the country was broke. And as a result, all through the period of the rise of Israel, England was still on rations. They were in rations into the 50s. And they weren't on big rations, they were in small rations. It's interesting. 1950. There's a famous thing I read many years ago from, just sticks in my mind. Harold Macmillan was a minister under Churchill. Churchill came back in 51, late 51. And they had a Conservative Party when it's all over. And later on, Macmillan was a prime minister. Some people may remember him. And he left these very voluminous diaries. And when they came in, the country of England, or Britain, is still on these rations. And it was like starvation rations. And they told Churchill, he said, nah, so you're exaggerating, because he was a rich guy, so he didn't go in rations. And they brought in to him, the Minister of Food brought in a plate, you know. And Churchill said, "This, so I have that also for the appetizer," or something like that. He said, "No, that's the whole meal." And then he said, "I guess, then the people are starving, that we have to do something." So all during the period we're talking about, England is a funny kind of situation. It's a world power. It's an imperial empire, obviously, but they were, you know, weak and strong at the same time. And the result, as far as we're concerned, is that Britain was totally dependent on the United States for bucks. Right? Now, there's no way that they were going to get anywhere unless the United States bailed them out big time. I mean, to the tunes of billions and billions. Okay? Now, whether they should have done it or not have done it, that's for a separate discussion. That's an interesting discussion in itself, but I'm not going to get into that. What's affecting us, what's affecting the Jews, the Zionists, and all that, the Middle East crisis, is the following interesting conundrum. And that is, during the years I'm talking about, if Britain goes too hard on the Yishuv, then the American Jews will oppose Congress giving money to England. And the English have to take that into account. They're on the ropes. Now, this drives the State Department people crazy. There's Rabbi Wise, the head of the Zionists in America, and he already says in 1946, England should not go so hard on the Jews. He, by the way, was a nice guy. He said, oh, definitely England should get the money, but the guys to the right of him will come across it like Abba Hillel Silver and says, cut them off. If they do that to us, then that's what they deserve. And the British ambassador has to do it. And General Marshall, who's the Secretary of State, is going crazy. He says, you're putting Jewish interests ahead of American interests. It's in America's interest, and it was, to have England as a strong country in Europe, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm not saying that Marshall was wrong. I'm just saying this was the politics that was happening in Israel's time. You know, the Rebbeinu Shalom so set things up that you had a funny balance of power on the one hand. Now, Winston Churchill would have kissed up to the American Jews. If you know who he is and who he was, that's exactly his style. When Roosevelt was in power, he used to invite Morgenthau to England every 2 months or things like this. Because he knew how things work in American politics. Clement Attlee and Ernest Bevin, who we'll talk about in a minute, they were not built that way. It wasn't in their makeup. And as a result, you couldn't get together a reconciliation or coming together of the two sides. Attlee was the leader of the, as they say, the Labor Party. He was a doctrinaire type guy. He had been very active in, child welfare movements. He was an idealist. He had been a major in the First World War. He was an interesting type person. Bevin was the power behind the throne. Bevin was the head of the trade unions. He came up from the ranks. I don't know, his father was a truck driver or something. He came from a very working class kind of background. You understand, maybe you don't. England has always been a much more class society than America. At least America perceives itself as not being a class society. Right? It's by no means unheard of that smart kids from poor backgrounds end up in Harvard and Yale, if you got the grades. In England, it was much, much more rare. Certain type of class of people end up in Oxford and Cambridge, and the others end up as truck drivers. This is your culture, and this is where you stay. And not only that, the lower classes, as they call themselves, perceive it proper that the upper classes should run things in a way that doesn't quite work in America. We perceive ourselves, I don't know, we could debate this, but we perceive ourselves as a kind of a different type of society. And so Ernest Bevin was the leader of the trade union movement. He became the foreign minister, the foreign secretary. He took hold of Middle East policy, and he's the guy that will run the show, and Attlee will more or less go along with him. Neither of these guys were to be perfectly honest, neither of these people would I would call anti-Semitic. On the other hand, neither of these people had any kind of human sympathy for the Jews whatsoever, whereas Churchill was one of these more romantic types. And Winston Churchill, all through his life, I remember even in America in the 1950s, I saw he came here. He always threw in a speech whenever he's on this subject. He said, "I've always been a Zionist, since I was young." I don't know if he meant it or not, but the very fact that he used that kind of thing is something you would never ever get out of these type of people. So these are the two guys, mainly, who are running the British policy in the years that we're talking about. They're pretty stuck up. They're not very sensitive to the nuances of the Jewish situation. Move to the next one. Here's Bevin and his two main colleagues. Some of us may remember this guy. He's a real son of a gun, right? Toynbee's history. You may possibly recall the fact that the way he worked out history, the Jews should have left the scene long ago. They're a fossil. Do you remember that? Well, he was one of the big mockers in British Middle East policy in the Chatham House. He was in what we call the Brookings Institution over there. And this guy, who most people never heard of, Harold Bealey, was the point man. He was the diplomat in charge of Middle East policy. He's the one that Bevin said, you get all the reports together, and what should we do with the Jews and the Arabs on the Palestine question? So, again, this is very British. You leave it to the experts. The public doesn't have much to say on the subject. The experts are highly educated from the upper classes, and they've had Oxford, Cambridge education, and they know what they're doing. I'm not saying that's true, but that's the situation the Jews had to put up with. That was the reality, because these guys control the Middle East. The British had all kinds of situations on their hands as far as the Middle East is concerned. They owned, by 1945, the British occupied just about all the countries, if you know how it works, just about all the countries in the Middle East. In other words, Egypt, Libya, Syria, they had the British Army in. Jordan was a satellite. Palestine, they occupied. Iraq was a kind of a satellite. It had a funny relationship, but it's a British type area. And, they own other areas in what they call now Kuwait and the Gulf states. These were not independent places at the time. So the British were all over the place over there. And they really did have national interests in there. If the Arabs go crazy over Zionism, the British stand to lose a lot. I'm not denying that. It's also true that for a country that's broke, one of the few sources of money coming in was the fact that British companies owned all the oil in the Middle East because of the imperialist system. In other words, this is the good old days of European colonialism. All the oil that was coming out of Iraq and Iran, right, and other places, Kuwait, and Middle East, really was owned by England. In those days, this is what generated Arab resentment and eventually Arab nationalism, and eventually the Arabs took this over. But I'm talking about in the good old days, before that all happened, and if you're talking about the 1940s and even the mid-40s, the British are the ones that make all the money on the oil in Iran and Iraq, and they give a piece of it to Iran and Iraq. They make all the money out of Kuwait, and they give a piece of it to Kuwait. And same thing with Libya and so on and so forth. Interesting world, isn't it? So you don't want to mess with that. Here's a country, as they say, is broke. One of the few things they're doing right, as far as economics is concerned, is they're making money in the oil. Why upset all of that? So I understand that you had these kind of situations. The British in Egypt had a really interesting time. Let's move to the next one. Because Egypt had been a British base, and the British had sort of taken over it. They chopped it in 1880s. The Egyptians intensely resented this. The British managed one way or another through front men to retain control. But there was no question the British were in charge, and the Egyptians super hated this. And the most famous incident of what I'm talking about, which is very well known, it's taught at the Egyptian public schools till today, is the incident. This guy was the king of Egypt at that time, like a major playboy, King Farouk. This guy was the British ambassador, which means he's the boss. Okay? Lord Killarn, Miles Lamson. In 1942, some people may be aware of this, Rommel is coming close to Egypt. In fact, he was in Egypt. El Alamein is in Egypt. The Egyptians are yearning, they're lusting to join Rommel. Sadat, remember, the president of Egypt, was one of the officers that wanted to fly over into the German lines. Nasser and all these other guys growing up. Listen, I understand why. If you're Egyptian, you hate the British. The enemy man is my friend. The Germans will be our friends. I understand that. So the Egyptians yearned to join the Egyptians yearned to join the Germans. The British weren't stupid. They had their spies, all the rest of it. And at the right moment, this guy comes in. It's like an old-fashioned Errol Flynn movie. They bust into the royal palace in 1942. He comes into the king's bedroom. He puts a gun to his head and says, "I guess you're going to fire the British ambassador. You're going to fire the government. And here's the list of the new prime ministers and everybody like this." And he can't do anything about it because the British are there and they got him. And so he goes along with it. And of course, a month later, the German army is destroyed in the Battle of Valmy, so it doesn't matter anymore. But the British figure like this. One of these, I mean, look at this guy. I mean, he's not real. He's going to wreck World War II? You understand? I mean, come on. I mean, Churchill was, I guess, throw him in the garbage can. But if you're Egyptian, this is like a rape. It's such a violation of the national dignity. They hate it. And so there are going to be continual riots against the British from 1945 to 1952. Okay, when they'll burn down all kind of British bases and terrorism and all this kind of business. And the British are like not sure how to handle Egypt. The Middle East is simmering. Okay, there are countries there, but they have funny relationships there. And one thing you don't want to do is tick them off with Palestine and the Jews. That's all we have enough trouble as it is. That's the way they look at it. As a matter of fact, because of what I said, and because of these incidents over here, the British really want to relocate from Egypt to Palestine. You don't have millions and millions of Egyptians over there. Palestine is also next to the Suez Canal, correct? Do the Sinai Desert and the Suez Canal. You won't be such a bone in the throat of all these Egyptians. The Jews are like us. I mean, that's what they thought. And the Arabs will go along. That was the idea. Now, the British want to remain in Palestine permanently. That's the direction of their thinking. Let's go to the next one. Here's the Middle East, of course. And they want to move from their main bases and everything to here. In the years I'm talking about, 45 to 47 or so, 100,000 British soldiers in Palestine, way more than you need. And that's because they set up huge bases and airfields and logistics and all this kind of stuff because they want to move it over there. Now, how are you going to do that? Okay? Basically, they want the Jews to forego all thoughts of statehood to accommodate to the British needs to have a base over there, and this is right after the Holocaust. So this is unbelievably narrow and selfish. It just goes to show you Oxford and Cambridge are educated guys, but they can't see out of their nose. And it's not a policy. It's the absence of a policy. That's really what's going on. And what I'm trying, therefore, to explain to you is that what happens in terms of the clashes between the British and the Jews, which, of course, does happen, as we all know, the Irgun and all the rest of that, is the result of misguided policies or non-policies, which were totally unrealistic because they didn't take into account at all what the Jews, for example, want. I mean, think about this. World War II is over. You got all these DPs over in Europe. The Jews, anyway, are saying we lost all these 6 million people because we didn't have a state. Finally, let's go. And Bevin and these other guys saying, no, we have to relocate the British army into Palestine, and the Jews should, after all, I mean, if you have Arnold Toynbee who's saying the Jews are a fossil, the rest of it, what you're really saying is you guys don't really count. So what did they expect the Jews are going to do? What did they think the Jews in America, for example, are going to roll over? You see, policymakers need to be realistic. They have to understand what's really going on, and these guys didn't do so. Now, by the way, as is always the case, the lack of a policy leads to what they call the opposite consequence of what you intend. And so, for example, the Zionist movement, in the face of all this, has a big shift to the right. In the famous 1946 World Zionist Conference in Switzerland, which was a big changeover. Let's go to the next one. You have this huge move to the right, and it's anti-British. Away from Chaim Weizmann, he's more or less fired. They give him a nice title, but more or less fired. And he becomes the big macher. Ben-Gurion becomes the big macher, and Ben-Gurion was in favor of, I'm going to fight the British, get him out of here somehow or other. And in American Zionism, Stephen Wise, who was always go along with the State Department, don't rock the boat, and all the rest of it, is moving for this guy, Abihail Silver, who was the opposite. He actually made a speech and said like this, here's what we're going to do. This is what he said in the speech. We're going to force the American government to change its policy. Right? And we'll talk about that more next week. But he, was a table thumper. And he was an inspiring leader. And the result is that the British end up with a lot more than they figured in the first place. And they're all shocked. This can only be from bad Jews or things like that. It's never our fault, obviously. And so hold that thought, and that's one half of the two partners that we're talking about tonight, the British. Now what about the Israelis, which there isn't in Israel yet, the Yishuv, as they call it, the Jewish community in Palestine, which by the time of 1945 was 500,000, 550,000. It's a state within a state. We've talked about that before. The British had permitted, under the mandate, for a variety of reasons, the Jews to have a complete autonomy in almost every area. And so, for the vast majority of the Jews who lived in Eretz Yisrael at that time, they were Zionists. They belonged to one Zionist party or another. They voted for their own parliament. There was a Knesset at that time. It wasn't the same Knesset, obviously, it is, but you understand, to run internal Jewish affairs. They had a ministry of education, a ministry of health, a ministry of this, that, and the other. Culture, I mean, the whole business of a state within a state. They had a Gucci Aliyah, which means that they had a carefully, this is bad, but it happened, that a carefully designed policy of small aliyah, of the right people that had been implemented since 1920. So the result is the vast majority of people who immigrate into Palestine in the 20s, 30s, and 40s are sort of like handpicked. They're people who were members of Zionist groups in Eastern and Central Europe. They had a hachshara of one kind or another. Many of them went to an ivrit type of schooling back in Poland or Hungary or Germany or someplace like that. They become ideologically aware when they come to Palestine. These are the ones who will either join kibbutzim or things like that, or if they're in the cities, they'll become very actively involved in Jewish and Hebrew things. They believe in national discipline, as they call it. They're very, activated, and this is, so to speak, the golden era of what you can call the white man Zionism, because all these Jews, for the great majority, are Ashkenazic Jews. There are no Haredim, because the few Haredim that live in Israel, because they're not Zionists, they're not part of the Knesset. It's not a national Knesset like you have when Israel becomes a state. And so it's sort of self-selective. I'll give you an example of what I'm talking about. The Aguda types just don't recognize the Knesset, so they don't vote. So of the 120 people, there's no Aguda party or Shas or anything like that. There's hardly any, there's a small minority of Sephardim. And so you don't have that. There's no communist party in the Knesset at that time. There are no Arabs in the Knesset at that time. You see what I'm saying? It's sort of like antiseptic, which will change, of course, when Israel becomes a state in 1948 and 49, as we know. But not in the period I'm talking about. So that's sort of like an unreal kind of, that's why I always called it Gucci kind of thing. It was very, custom tailored. Tel Aviv is the capital without question. All Hebrew city, right? And the Yishuv in general, already at that time, had all the advantages as well as the disadvantages of a Central European parliamentary democratic system. In other words, you had a lot of different parties, not one or two. You have bureaucracy everywhere. You have Protexia running everything. You have endless debates and discussions. They have votes on every subject, who often hymns. The Haganah, to give you an example, was run by a committee. Let me give you one example. The Haganah is run by a committee. The committee has 2 members from the Mizrahi, 2 members from the General Zionists, 3 members from the Mapai, 3 members from the Mapam, 3 members from, I forget what other party it is. There's a whole group that gets together, and these are the guys that decide who should be the general, how much weapons they should get. Should they get weapons in the first place? And after all, we might be too much on the British. In other words, they have endless shul. The bottom line is, they ran Haganah, they ran everything like a shul. Now in America, they have a word for this, and that's democracy. Right? But it's got its pluses and minuses. This is how the Yishuv ran over there. Well, let me put it this way. In 1948, 47, 48, Ben Gurion will sort of move in there and say, enough of this, I'm taking over. Get it? Because, action has to be done over here. And that'll cause all kind of issues. That was not the tradition. Everything was run, as they say, on this party kind of business, and it was what it was. They thought, now, the Jews in Eretz Yisrael at that time all thought, because everybody likes to be optimistic, you and I do today all as well, they thought that the British Labour Party, when they won the election in 1945, would do another Balfour Declaration or even better. They'll pull it off. And I want to tell you something. The reason they thought that was because the official platform of the British Labour Party when they ran in 1945, you won't believe this, included transfer. It said Palestine should become a Jewish state and the Palestinians should be kicked out and moved elsewhere. Bevin, Attlee, all these guys, this is the platform that they themselves signed and wrote. Even the Jews at that time didn't ask for that. Okay, so, think about that. Of course, they soon realized that Bevin and all these guys were their worst nightmare because I'd be shocked to hear the politicians lie, but I've heard it happens once in a while. The British basic plan was a divide and conquer. It's very interesting. This is traditional British imperial strategy. I guess it's traditional imperial strategy everywhere. The British said like this: we want to stay in Palestine forever. So here's the Taina. The Jews are an outnumbered minority. They're a large number, but the Arabs are double more than them. There's 500,000 Jews. There's over 1 million Arabs. We can't leave. The Arabs will kill the Jews. And the Jews say, I guess, well, then let us bring in a majority. Can't do that. Be against the Arabs. Who's going to be the referee over here? Can't leave them alone. Somebody has to be in charge. I guess that's our job. You understand? We're going to stay there. There'll be a base, a military, and other base, but that's not really why we're staying there. The reason we're staying there is for altruistic reasons, in order to keep these two babies, from tearing each other to bits. This is the basic idea. Well, the Jews weren't falling for that. They're very embittered. The Jewish, and the Arabs, the Palestinians and the Jews both said the same thing. Get out of the way and let us take care of this. You understand? We'll handle this. We don't need the British over here. So, because there's no policy, and because the Jews are big enough now to do something about it, 500,000, so they contemplate a struggle with Britain. And as they do, it's a very interesting calculus of force, because they know the British can crush them in a second. That was obvious. All throughout the period I'm talking about, if the British army, especially 100,000 men, wished to, if the British wanted to play hardball, they can play hardball. They know how. Perhaps you've heard of the word concentration camps. Some of you may know that this was invented by the British in the Boer War. Because when he fought in South Africa, and the South Africans defeated him a couple of times, the British said, we're taking the gloves off. Now, this is a time when there was no CNN, so I'm talking about 1900, and they literally rounded up every man, woman, and child of the Boers in South Africa and literally put them in concentration camps, where lots of them died of this, that, and the other, and they broke their back. If they really, really wanted to, they could shoot everybody. The Jews couldn't really tolerate a situation in which the British unleash their force against them, but they also knew that the British are constrained by United States public opinion. So it's a delicate balance of power. Okay, not too different, as we'll see, than the situation of Israel today with the Palestinians. If they wanted to, they have the power to unleash against them. Can't do it. Middle East, funny place. All right. Well, World War II, no strains. The German army went full bore against the Russians. The Russians went full bore against them. The Americans bombed the heck out of the civilians. In Germany and Japan, you know this and I know this. They killed 1 million, 2 million civilians for the air raids. Dresden, for example, I'm sure many people know, was bombed in February, March of 45 when it was already clear the war was over. They just wanted to take out a city. So they bombed them day after day after day until the whole place turned into flames. That's called war with no rules. Here, after 1945, as far as Palestine is concerned, can't do that. I'm sure the British are, gritting their teeth. So how far can the British be pushed? Well, that's a machlokes. That's an argument among the Jews. Very far, according to the Irgun and the Lehi. Not so far, according to Ben Gurion and his company. True? Here we come to, that's what Begin looked like, Menachem Begin in the 40s. Not the way many people remember him. And when he was older, of course. And Menachem Begin was 100% aware that British can't really unleash their power against the Jews. If the Irgun has a struggle, and they do, of course, in these years, against the British, they're totally aware that they're doing so in a very specific political context. I can do a lot of things to you, and you can't do this to me. How far you can go is not clear to everybody. Now, you and I know today, because of hindsight, the British never did really unleash everything against the Jews. But the Jews, in the back of their mind, especially in Palestine, say, I don't know, they could go crazy and kill us all or something. Or they could hand the country over to the Arabs. Don't push so far. And you can hear both sides of that. The difference in analysis is what created a permanent tension among the Jewish groups during these years. So the Jews had small military forces. You had the Haganah, you had the Palmach, you had the Irgun and the Lehi. The Haganah basically didn't exist. I don't know what they tell you in propaganda, all the rest, but the Haganah basically, as I say, it was a couple committees, and they had the skeleton of a general staff, but not really. They had a professor from the Technion, the Drury, in charge of all this. They didn't know anything. They didn't have any kind of real officers with any kind of training, except a tiny group that fought with the British. And the British were very smart. They didn't let many Jews fight with them in World War II because they knew exactly what's going on. Haganah is like the NWCP or one of these groups. You're supposed to show up at so-and-so often and have 2 hours of pistol training or something, it may be, if the British aren't looking. And, they really would send you out like they do now. You have a 30% attendance rate, a 50% attendance rate. It's a schlepper operation. You understand? This is the truth. They knew it themselves, but on the other hand, they had the skeleton structure of a future military. But only that. They have very few weapons. I mean, I can give you numbers, but they had 2,000 guns or something. It's crazy numbers. The Palmach was started by the Jewish Agency in 1942 when they thought Rommel was going to break in, and that they kept in. But the whole Palmach, they had more training. These are the ones that had a bigger amount of military, but they also didn't have any weapons. And anyway, in the time I'm talking about, 2,000 boys, 500 girls. 2,500. I don't have to tell you, this is tiny. And this is the elite. The Irgun, altogether, if you get down to the numbers, probably also had 2,500, 3,000 people. That's all. It's incredible, these small numbers. And the Lechi, if I'm wrong by a couple hundred. And the Lechi, the Stern Gang, was in the hundreds, less than 1,000. So it's what you call a terrorist war. I'll explain what I mean. But one thing that they had a consensus on, by the way, just to prove my point, most people, some of you may possibly have heard of him, most people have never heard of him. He was the commander-in-chief of the Haganah at that time. By the way, this guy later changed his mind, became the head of the Israel Communist Party. Yeah, I love Israel. His name is Moshe Sneh, means his real name is Kleinbaum. It's Sneh, a little thing. Yeah, he'd been a general Zionist, and he had a whole business. This guy was around for many years, but if you're Israeli, you know who Yisrael Galili was. He was basically the head of the Palmach. My point is, we're not talking about Moshe Dayan over here. We're certainly not talking about Napoleon or anything like that. You're talking about whatever. Now, the only consensus that had formed was that the Season that we talked about last year was a bad idea. By 1945, we'd gone through this period that I discussed before, where for a variety of reasons, the Haganah cooperated, the Palmach cooperated with the British. They fingered a lot of guys in Irgun and all the rest. They tortured and killed them. But what was the result? The British didn't give them Palestine. And it left a bad taste in everybody's mouth. If you remember, the Irgun wanted to hit back at them, and Begin said, just turn the other cheek, which was a statesman-like move at that time. And the result was that by the time the war's over, all the Jews agree, I don't like the Irgun, I don't like this group and the other group, but we shouldn't be traitors and collaborators and cooperate with the British against all the Jews. You follow? So that you didn't have in the years I'm talking about, thank God, in 45, 46, 47, 48, a civil war among the different Jewish groups. And the bottom line is that the Haganah to the Irgun was roughly, you might like this, you might not like this, but it's roughly the relationship between the Fatah today and the Hamas, which means that they both were very much against the British, but these guys were a little more aware of political correctness, and the other guys were less so. The Haganah and Ben Gurion Jewish Agency, they condemned terrorism, but not really, any more than the Arab types that today do so. They condemned it for PR purposes as far as the international press and all that, but they weren't really against it. At times, they actually secretly cooperated, just like all these Arabs groups do at times also now, if you really follow what goes on. They get along, they don't get along, they get along, they don't get along. And so they had something called the Tenuat HaMered, for example, for a while, which is, of course, the revolt movement, which means they're going to get together. But then they broke apart, and basically Ben Gurion is against anybody not being under his authority for the understandable reasons that a democracy can't have different powers. But there was no consensus, so the others said like this, the heck with you, and they went on as they did. There were times of internecine conflict. It came close a number of times in the years I'm talking about to actual shooting between one side and the other, but it didn't happen, thank God. Now, the Irgun and the Lechi, therefore, deliberately waged in 45, 46, 47, into 48 a terrorist war. You might like the term or not, but that's what it is. Now, terrorism is a particular type of war. The problem is a lot of people don't understand this. Clausewitz, some of you may know, the famous German military theorist, correctly said that war is all about politics, meaning that you are engaging in a war to attain a certain end. And it's an end involving your enemy. And basically what you want to do is you want your enemy to do X, Y, or Z. In a regular big war. You want to conquer the enemy and totally break them, like the Allies did to the Germans for the Japanese, for example, in World War II. But there are a lot of times in history where they argue over a piece of land, two countries, and what they're all about is, I want the other country to withdraw from this territory. Right? That's your political end. In a terrorist war, the terrorist group says, we don't have a lot of men, we can't take on the armies, that's just the way it is, but we want to attain a certain political end anyway. And so we're going to do so by playing with the mind, or to do certain acts that will psychologically affect the other side and get them to do what we want to do. For limited ends, as we all know, terrorism can sometimes work for limited ends. So, for example, it was all about getting the British out of Palestine. Eventually it worked. Gets the Americans out of Iraq. Do you agree with that? Main reason we want to get out of Iraq is we know our guys keep getting blown up every week for some stupid reason by road bombs and things like this. Agreed? Right? And similar areas like that. So if it's a limited end that doesn't affect your vital basic interests, maybe it works. This is why the terrorism war so far, thank God, has not worked against Israel. Because they just, where's Israel going to go? It's not like they want them. They did succeed, as we know, in getting Israel out of the West Bank. They did succeed, as we know, in getting the Hitnat Kut, get them out of Gaza Strip. Because the Israelis themselves viewed them as, right or wrong, as non-vital interests. But when they want to go into Israel proper, so that kind of terrorism they haven't been able to do. But that's the theory of the so-called terrorist war. It was an urban terrorist war that I'm talking about over here. Because it's not one of these situations where you run and hide in the mountains, like you find in some countries. There are no mountains in Israel. It's all Arab territory. It's a funny thing. The Jews were a tiny group in Palestine. How do you have a terrorist war against England? So they had to do the classic terrorist business of blending in and disguising themselves as members of the population, which we all know is widely practiced today. So, it's just changing names and forms, but it's the essential parts of it are the same. If this is the case, then what terrorists always want to do, as I say, is play with the mind. You want high-profile acts because all publicity is good. That's a certain insight. You can agree with it or disagree with it, but I'll tell you the way these people think, which is all PR is good. Good and bad, because you want to get your case out there to the terrorist. The worst thing in the world is that people don't pay attention to it anymore. Those kind of movements that are not working today are the ones that the public doesn't hear about. You understand? If I tell you there's a terrorist war going on, and I think there is, in Ceylon or something like that, you say, it's over, okay? See, there's my point, okay? Only one geek here actually heard about it. Sri Lanka. My point, though, is you understand that if nobody notices it, then you can't get any traction out of your acts because you blow up one here, you destroy a tank there, you kill a guy there. If it doesn't get out and it doesn't resonate or ring with the public, then compare that, for example, compare that with the value, the high-profile value, I'm sorry to say, Gilad Shalit. One soldier. If this was Russia, they say, kill, who cares about one soldier? Israel's not built that way. So, by all of us getting wrapped up in Gilad Shalit, as we all know, we actually helped the Arabs. Isn't that right? Because we made it a front-page thing, and we made it something that Israel was in a position to give up 1,000 prisoners in order to get them back. That's the essence of what I'm talking about. You understand? It's a funny way of operating. I bet you many of you here are old enough to remember, we used to hear all the time on the news, more people were killed this week on the traffic accidents than in the Vietnam War. Remember that? And it was true, but it doesn't grab you that way. Correct? It doesn't grab you that way. If you hear somebody's killed in a war, it's a Jew, chas v'shalom, dies in a car accident, God forbid. It doesn't mean anything. Then you find he was deliberately murdered by some anti-Semite in France. All of a sudden, it's a completely different... It's a mind. The psychology of this kind of war is fascinating because it plays with all the human weaknesses. So therefore, you'll find that Begin and people that blow up the King David Hotel. Right? Because, and of course, a lot of civilians get killed, as we all know. I can't give you a blow-by-blow description in our thing, but you know what I mean. And, it got on front page. It was great. Can we run that? Yeah. Here, of course, the King David Hotel. obviously. And you understand what's going on over here. This is right after it's all over. British soldiers pulling out the dead bodies. That was the whole thing. Okay. And that piece got on all, there wasn't TV at that time, but remember they used to show it in the movies in between, things that gets everywhere. And all of a sudden people's like this, oh, Palestine, why are they blowing up hotels? What's going on over here? Oh, it's the Jews. The British won't let them in. You get your message out there. Then you had the famous story of the hanging of the British sergeants, which is a high-profile business. If you can run this, it'll tell the story for me, if it works.
No sooner did the commission leave Palestine when fresh violence erupted. It began with the British, who hanged 3 condemned Irgun members in this cell at Acre Prison. A heavy pall of mourning descended upon the Jewish community.
Well, they got their point, right? No PR is bad PR. And I'm not saying this is a happy situation. It's a terrible situation, but it happened. And everybody in the world knew about it. Then you had the situation of the defiant martyrdom of the Irgun members at the gallows. Knows when they condemned and hanged these guys. A lot of them, these 3 in Gruner is very famous, and maybe you've heard of these other people. Maybe you haven't. They're either hanged by the British or they commit suicide just before they're about to be hanged. And when they have these high-profile trials, they use it to issue all these heroic things. I mean, I have here the piece from Mayor Feinstein, who says, this is in Hebrew, of course, is officers of the army of conquest. A regime of hanging trees is the regime you wish to impose on this land, which was destined to be a lighthouse for all of humanity. And in your foolish wickedness, you presumed that by this regime you will break our people's spirit, to people to whom this country has been a gallows. You are wrong. You will learn that you have encountered steel, forged in the fire of love and hatred, love for the homeland and freedom, hatred of enslavement and invader. It is burning steel, you British tyrants, etc., etc. So his whole speech, which wasn't considered tedious in those days. These 2 guys, by the way, for a variety, the story's too long for me to explain now, they killed themselves just before they're supposed to be hanged. Menachem Begin, when he died in the 90s, so he's supposed to be buried on Mount Herzl with the, Herzl and Jabotinsky and all that's like the Mount Herzl, sort of the Kodesh HaKadoshim of the Zionist movement. But in his will, he said he wants to be bearing the Harazim next to these two guys, right? So you have that kind of resonance where, for one people, they're positive figures, one people negative figures, and the result is that you have a lot. When you hear this kind of heroic stuff, the average Jew in America, for example, or elsewhere, says, "Look, we don't exactly condone violence and terrorism. We do not, but you have to admit they're brave boys." This kind of talk is in the synagogues and the country clubs and in the federation meetings and around the world. So I'm sorry to say, the terrorism does work. And the ultimate victory of this kind of policy is what they call the Bevingrads. And maybe you noticed it, maybe you didn't. But by the time you get to 46 and 47, the terrorists own the street, meaning the British, in order to protect themselves, have to be in fortified barbed wire areas in every Jewish area, in Tel Aviv and Haifa and Yerushalayim and elsewhere. To get into the British area, you have to go. So who's the one in charge? You get it? The Americans, by the way, face exactly this problem in Afghanistan and other countries like that. It's sad, but we're the good guys, they're the bad guys, but they control the street, because that's what happened with terrorism. By disguising themselves as part of the population, you don't know what you're dealing with. Vietnam, we had this problem. But, it's not a conventional war where this side wears blue and that side wears gray or something like that. That we know how to do. These other things, modern countries like America have to learn. They call it counterinsurgency, meaning you have to understand what I'm talking about and devise countermeasures. Israel, of course, totally has to deal in counterinsurgency, sometimes more successfully, sometimes less so. For example, a major element in the counterinsurgency is you have to have a very good spy network among the terrorists. You see? The British had a so-so one. The Jews had a better spy network among the British. This is how it went. And so, basically, what I'm trying to get across is, during all these years, which were not happy years, the basic British dilemma is, how do you hit back without hitting too hard? And that's the same dilemma that Israel faces today. Agreed or not? How do you hit back at them without hitting too hard? Because if you hit too hard, the other side wins. We live in that world. By 1947, the British were so angry at all this stuff that they knew Begin, for example, was hiding somewhere in Tel Aviv. They surround the whole Tel Aviv and they go house to house. They went through every house. And the only reason they didn't find him was because he was hiding in the attic somewhere in between the boards. He almost died from the heat. It's a famous story in his memoirs. You can read it. But the fact that they're willing to go house to house shows you that they're really, ticked off. And ultimately, what the British did not understand, because it was early in the 20th century, was that the main point over here is message spin control. And if they allow, as they did, the Jewish groups of one kind or another to get their message out there, then what comes out is these are not a bunch of killers who are blowing up hotels and all that, which is what you hear in the Palestinian rhetoric today, because they have mastered the message spin control, I'm sorry to say. But at that time, it wasn't that way. Instead, you were getting the Jewish spin on this, which is, look, the British can't control Palestine. The Jews are seething over here. They're blowing up hotels. The British should get out and all that. While this was going on, and there was no way that this group by itself could get it British out, but they may have play a major role in making life miserable for them. The Jewish agency, the regular, quote-unquote, legal part of the Jewish groups, Ben Gurion and all that, fruitlessly spent the years in one meeting after another trying to get concessions from the British. The main concession that the Jews wanted at that time was not a statehood. The main concession they wanted at that time was Aliyah. Because after all, the Jews are a small minority in Palestine. I'm not talking about Jordan, I'm talking about Palestine. There were 500,000 Jews or whatever, and there were 1.25 million Arabs, Palestinians. This is a basic problem. Now, the British keep saying like this, we can't hand the country over to you. I mean, this is all circular logic. Can't hand the country over to you. It's an Arab majority. They said, well, then let us bring in Jews. Oh, can't do that. Get the Arabs angry. You understand? And so this is the kind of double talk that enrages young Jews to join an Irgun or a Lehi or something like that. And, believe me, Bevin always said, no, no, no. Now, it's tricky because President Truman supported the specific demand of Aliyah on what you call, quote unquote, on humanitarian grounds. Now, the British said, like, it's humanitarian baloney, you want votes. Perhaps. But it's also true that that the spin control was of such a nature that everybody said, yeah, they should let the DPs out of the terrible camps that they are in Germany and let them go to Palestine, which is one country that wants them, and to be physically and mentally rehabilitated and culturally so. And what's the problem with that? In other words, the Americans, the president anyway, kind of bought into the spin control. And as you find today, again, I don't like to use this as an example, but to my mind, it is an example. You'll find today people say like this: why didn't Israel let food into Gaza and place like that? Israel said, look, it's a whole business and a terrorist, all the rest of it. But why didn't you let food into Gaza? That means that the other side has gotten control of the PR. And it's sad. You know, Turkey and Israel have a crisis over this now. And it was reversed, so to speak, in the 1940s. The British already, when Attlee and Bevin took over in 1945, sought to co-opt the Americans and get them to see the British side of things and join them by forming in 1940 what we call the Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry. A bunch of Americans and a bunch of Englishmen get together. They'll study the Palestine question over there for the umpteenth time and see what they come out with. Bevin wanted to drag America in, which means, you see, if you want to comment on how we should run things in Palestine, give us soldiers, give us money, give us political support, all the rest of it. Truman said, well, I'm not doing that. I mean, there was zero political support, obviously, for supporting the British mandate against the Jews in Palestine. And so, if you go to the next slide, these two guys end up hating each other in many respects, although in every other area in the 1940s, Britain was the staunchest ally of America in the Cold War. America ends up giving them billions because England and America were fighting against Russia, basically. They're the number one ally. I might say they still are. Which country went in with us into Iraq at the end of the day? Into Afghanistan. You know this. I have friends, some in intelligence agencies and things like this, a few, and they'll tell you, I mean, it's not a secret, even to this day, the United States government has an intimate relationship with the Brits, such as they have with no other country. You understand? And so the Anglo-American idea is a very powerful one, and this is one bone between them because of contention. Because on Israel and Palestine, they can't agree. Now, Bevin, of course, said like this: you can't agree because they're afraid of the Jewish vote in America. And Truman, of course, no, it has nothing to do with that. And the result is that you have all this tension. The Anglo-American Commission of Inquiry does meet. They heard testimony from both sides. They produced a balanced report which said that the Jews should disband their army, the Arabs should disband their army, there should be a partial state of this, that, and the other. Is the next one? Yeah. They said they proposed maybe this will be the Jewish state, this little part over here, this will be the Arab state, this will be something in the middle. Not very, very different from what happened in the end, I mean, except for the Negev. But Truman, political dynamite, he's not going to say the Jews should have such a little part. So he says, I endorse paragraph 5 of the commission report, the one that says bring 100,000 Jews into Palestine. And Bevin gets really angry. He said, what about the rest of it? You can't do that in nowhere. And Truman says, I could do whatever I want. And drives Bevin up the wall. And very famous that Truman issues this. I mean, to be perfectly honest, Truman issues this endorsement a week before the congressional elections in 1946, what he called the Yom Kippur message. Right? It was in October of 46. Obviously, congressional elections are in early November. This is the President of the United States always issues a thing to fellow Jews. Excuse me, now that it's the Day of Atonement, we all join something, in self-reflection, all the rest of it. He didn't do any of that. He said, I guess I'm in favor of 100,000 Jews moving to Palestine. And it didn't work because in 1946, you had another political landslide where Republicans destroyed the Democrats in both houses of Congress. You understand? This was, as I told you before, Truman was a politically weak president. Then the Republicans were able to pass the Taft-Hartley bill, all the rest of it. He really was powerfully weakened, and he was the reason they lost. They ran on the Truman slogan. You want to talk about vicious? There used to be an expression like this in those days. What would Roosevelt do if he were alive? So Republicans put out the following campaign slogan for the congressional elections in 1946. What would Truman do if he were alive? You understand? So I mention this because in a pure politics sense, this will simply give the Jews increased leverage over the Truman administration getting ready for the next elections in 1948. Is that a fact? He had to run, and he almost lost in 48, and he was really desperate politically, And if you're a Democrat running at that time, you have several constituents. You have the labor unions, you have this, that, and the other. One group you have to have. Okay? How are you going to win without New York? Now, I'll tell you something interesting. I'll jump ahead. Truman will win without New York. Many don't know this. He loses New York and a couple other big Jewish states, and he wins anyway. But he certainly needed Jewish campaign contributions. This is a major... Truman lost Maryland. It's a different state. You can go, like I say, go Google it or something like that. Presidential 40. It's very interesting. He put together a most unusual collection of states. He lost the South. Right? Yeah, they had the Dixiecrats. It's a very, very interesting political election, obviously. But one very interesting that happens over here is that one of the members, let's go to the next one, of the Anglo-American Commission is this guy. He's a high-profile Hollywood lawyer, Bartley Crum. He later was famous for being the lawyer for the Hollywood 10. And he was a William Randolph Hearst, Herbert Hoover Republican. Truman put him on the commission, and he comes back saying, basically, the Zionists are right. And he publishes a bestseller. You ever heard of the Iron Curtain? Yeah, you've heard of the Iron Curtain, which is a phrase of 1946. Well, he talks about what? The British have the Silken Curtain. You see? And what's really going on is they're oppressing the Jews behind the Silken Curtain. And it's a bestseller, and it's, nobody planned on this. He just did this on his own. And he's Bartley Cavanaugh Crum, and that was a leading Catholic Republican lawyer, but you can't get better than that. And the result is that increased pressure in this country as a result of that the Jews are the good guys, the British and the Arabs are the bad guys, and the British are really, really the bad guys. So what does the non-terrorists do other than talk at that time? The answer, of course, is the Hapalah. This is a great area of that. The Hapalah is the Hebrew word for the illegal immigration, Exodus and all the boats that we all know that happens at this time. What was treif in 1938 is kosher in 1946. Before the Second World War, Jabotinsky advocated and did some of these boats and bring illegals in. At that time, Ben-Gurion, the federations in America, the ZOA, and the others said, oh, this is terrible. It should only be legal immigration, and they're bringing in the wrong kind of Jews, and anyway, they're ripping them off. It was a very bad thing that they did over there. After the Second World War, it changes altogether. It's politically correct, and as we all know, this is a high-profile, so to speak, politically correct activity because you're not killing anybody. You're just bringing people over. If the boat gets in, good. If the British stops the boat and does that, oh, also good. You get good photo ops, correct? And look, if you read, you'll find that the United Nations Commission, the UNSCOP, in 1947, which is deciding the question, we'll talk about next week or whatever, whether or not they should be a Jewish state within a partition or not. When they're holding their meetings in Palestine, and they're balanced, because the Arabs don't want it, the British don't want it, the Jews want it. One of the things that happens over there, and they're propagandized from both sides. One of the things that happens, and these are Swedes and Guatemalans and the Turks and others, the British make a big mistake. They have the commission happens to be in Haifa the day the Exodus arrives. And they see all these refugees knocked off over here and then put back on a boat for Germany. You can't get better than this, right? Judge Sandstrom and Fabregat from Brazil and all the other guys who write the books, they say, oh, this was it. This is what changed us to be in favor of the Jew. We see there has to be a Jewish state. Now, that's emotion. That's got nothing to do with it, logic. Okay, so what? You see, this is the kind of battles that were fought over there. Notice the whole Hapalah, or illegal immigration, if you want to call it the boats, phenomenon was a political weapon that the Jewish agency waged against the British, like Israel today, as I said before, in its blockade of Gaza. Like the Palestinians of today, the Jews then were able to turn it into political capital. That's what they did with that boat convoy, right? Into an international climate of opinion that could sympathize with the Jewish desire for a state in spite of, in the face of, the unanimous Arab and Palestinian, which majority population, opposition. It's just interesting that the Jews, the Zionists, were able to win that battle for the international hearts and minds in a way that they couldn't do today. The British, of course, through all this, have a wildly exaggerated idea of the Haganah strength. They say, oh, the Jews could put 100,000 armed troops in the streets tomorrow and take over the country. This was in cuckoo land, The awkwardness of this political situation is reflected in what we call the Night of the Bridges, which means the Palmach, this is really interesting. The Palmach, at the command of the Jewish agency, wanted to show the British what good allies the Jews would make to the British, how capable they are. And so what they do is they blow up all the bridges leading into the country. Look how we can pull off a coordinated operation. The British freak out. They think it's like some kind of major attack. And what they do is they arrest all the Jewish leaders of the Jewish Agency. They imprison them in Latrun. They arrest Rav Maimon, the head of the Mizrahi, on Saturday. So no, they force him as an old man. Let's go to the next picture. They force him into a military car and all the rest of it. Everything blows up in everybody's face. And then they have to release them, of course, because who do you end up negotiating with? Israel, once again, has this chunk with people like Barghouti and these other guys in which they have him in jail. They want to let him go afterwards. Who are they going to negotiate with? The British got themselves into a real mess. On the other hand, although there was a consensus among the Jews on the good side of ha'apala, of illegal immigration, and on opposing the British plans for Palestine, there was no consensus among the Jews on an actual political plan of what do you actually want to do positively. For example, Weizmann wanted very much to maintain a mandate. Just it should be better for the Jews, more aliyah. Ben-Gurion wanted an independent state. He wanted a Jewish one. The Mapam party, which is the Palmach soldiers, are all members of the Mapam. They wanted a binational state. They were really in cuckoo land. Right? They want a state of 50-50 Jews and Palestinians. Where were they living? Martin Buber and people like that will settle for a total Palestinian state with guaranteed rights for the Jews. That's beyond cuckoo land. The Irgun wants the original map. They want Jordan. Israel and Jordan. And there's the shul meeting. Right? There you have it. The Arabs, by the way, are bystanders in all this. They don't participate in this war between the Jews and the British. It's weird. The Irgun blows up something, run over here. I'm just standing there watching there. Because the British, as long as they kept the immigration away, or they kept it to a trickle, that satisfied the basic Arab demands. You follow? There were already laws that the British had put on record back in 1939 forbidding extensive land sales to the Jews. And so the Arabs simply want the British to leave, which they're confident they'll do eventually, and then it'll be an Arab state. After all, we outnumbered them 2-1. The Palestinians, I might say, were tainted by the Hitler-Husseini connection. The Grand Mufti of Jerusalem is Amin al-Husseini. This was the leading family that I'll talk about in the future. There's the famous image I'm sure you've seen before. There's the Mufti going visit Adolf Hitler and giving him a Sieg Heil and all the rest of it. Notice, people don't realize this today. Hitler has allies, the Palestinians. You understand? But they don't think it's anything wrong. As a matter of fact, they'll tell you right now, the Zionists are worse, and made worse Holocaust than Hitler. Hitler was a misunderstood idealist and so forth. But not in the 1940s, you can't say that. The Arabs stubbornly refused to disassociate from the Mufti, which was a PR gift to Zionism. Right? The media message, KISS, the media message in those years, in the late 40s, is Palestinian nationalism equals fascism. I told you before, that's a toxic connection. That's why The Nation, the leading left-wing publication in America, is the #1 champion of Zionism and of a Jewish state in the late 1940s, because they're against the fascists. Who's that? The Arabs. Oh, everybody knows the Arabs are led by fascist leaders and so forth. So they have no legitimacy whatsoever. I mean, the Palestinians shot themselves in the foot is what I'm trying to say during those years. And finally, what brings us to a denouement is that in 1947, for totally separate reasons, the British decide to get out of India. Once you get out of India, what do you need Palestine for, strategically? The whole point was to hold on to the Suez Canal. The Suez Canal has no real meaning for England except as a way to get to India. Once the British are out of India, what exactly do you need the Suez Canal for? Yeah. Now, the British want to hold on to it, but it doesn't have that vital aspect that it had before. So, as I wind this down, in the final analysis, England's policy, Bevan's policy, was misconceived. He thought he could get the Jews to want the British to stay, to protect them from the hordes of the Arab world. But the Jews didn't act that way, correctly so. Who wants to be always dependent on the British policymakers, which after all, the same gang that sacrificed the 6 million during the Shoah? The worse things got in Palestine, when they blow up the sergeants, when they kidnap this person and that person, blow up hotels, the more in Parliament you keep getting the questions in London, exactly why are we here? And there's no good answer, is there? And England was financially strapped. The Marshall Plan of 1947, the Truman Doctrine of 1947, all the stuff comes to a head in that fateful year of 1947 when England is broke, Truman has to take over their obligations. That's the Truman Doctrine. In Greece and in Turkey, they have to give them $6-7 billion as special bailout, and then the Marshall Plan gives, altogether $15 billion to the England and the other countries over there. England was sort of like an economic collapse, as we would say today, and that's why, as you see over here, when the decision makers are looking at the world in 1947, England is funny. It's a strong country with weak legs, as you might say. Finally, an exhausted and embittered Britain will refer to the Palestine case to the United Nations, because they just had it. They said,